Chapter 19. After the Great Mix-Up, when the New World began, there were certain types of people who became valuable. Some because of jumping into a useful body, such as one that is young, healthy, and strong. Others because of their minds. Dawn was one of the latter. A trauma surgeon of the highest order, top of her class across every step of school. A true master. By the time of the Great Mix-Up, she was in her late 50s and nearing the end of a career that had saved many lives. She could have made such a difference in the new world. When everything changed over, she was out to dinner at one of the finest and most exclusive restaurants in New York City. With her were her wife, who was a Broadway actress, and a Broadway director with his fashion designer husband. They had already finished their meals. Dawn had no idea it would be her last. A third bottle of very expensive Tuscan red wine had just been ordered. Dawn had always been fond of that wine since visiting the winery with her wife some years back. The group was laughing and telling stories from their youth. Everyone at the table was interested in what Dawn had to say, since her career and life were far more impactful than theirs. This is not to say that Broadway performances and fashion could not and did not make a difference in the old world, but compared to being a trauma surgeon, it was no contest. Always modest, Dawn was doing her best to downplay her impact and the importance of her work. At every opportunity, she attempted to turn the conversation toward one of the others. It was during one of these moments when it happened. The director had just asked if she had ever operated on anyone famous. She had, but couldn't mention any names due to confidentiality. She was taking a sip of wine as a stalling tactic to measure her response, but never got the chance to speak. Mid-sip, before she could even swallow the delicious red, everything dropped out. Suddenly, she was in London. She would recognize those streets anywhere after more visits than she could count. She was now in the body of a young man in his mid-20s. It was early morning, and the city had been teeming with life when everything changed over. A combination of people closing out a wild night at the pubs and others just beginning their days. Things escalated quickly. Dawn had the wherewithal to duck into the nearest building. She found the stairwell and climbed to the top. It was a smart, logical move. There was madness on the ground, so move to higher ground. Once on the roof, she stepped to the edge and watched as the scene on the ground rapidly devolved from confused chaos to violent chaos. Then she questioned him for allowing whatever had just happened to happen. She needed to take a breath. She turned away from the ledge, then slid down it and pulled her new knees to her new chest. She couldn't help but laugh at how strange and absurd it felt to be in a young man's body. There would be time for exploring later, but the differences between the two setups were already apparent. Her eyes closed, and her head dropped between her legs. She tried to drown out sounds of chaos coming from below. She needed to think, to meditate. She assumed she would be up there for a while, at least until things calmed down below. And who knew how long that might take? There was just one thing she didn't account for: the thousands of planes that fell from the sky in those first minutes. By the time her new ears picked up the sound, it was too late. She rose and turned to see the commercial aircraft bearing down upon her. She sprinted to the stairwell and was halfway down the first flight when the plane connected with the building. The impact turned the building to rubble within seconds. She was dead in an instant. She could have made an incredible difference in the new world. Her medical knowledge and surgical skills could have saved many lives. Instead, as with billions of others, she died senselessly in the early moments. What remained of her new body would never be recovered. It spent the rest of eternity mixed in with the rubble. Chapter 20. It had been a long wait, but it had been worth it. She knew how lucky she was. She knew she should have died within the first days, hours or even minutes of the Great Mix-Up. Before the world was turned upside down, she'd lived a very normal life. She was 34 years old, married with 2 children, another on the way, and had a job she enjoyed. She lived in the same small Kentucky suburb where she had grown up. Amy never had much interest in anything more than that. She went to sleep happy. She woke up happy. Then one night, she took a seat on the couch next to her high school sweetheart husband, blinked a few times, dozed off, and was suddenly somewhere in Europe, in the body of a 2-year-old girl. Very few people who found themselves in the bodies of small children survived the early days of the New World. They were too weak, and there was too much chaos. Amy got lucky. The young body she had found herself in was living on a farm in Eastern Europe. At the exact moment of the great mix-up, the little girl was on an old, worn couch watching TV while her mother prepared breakfast. The key to everything was the random luck of who woke up in the bodies of the little girl's parents. It could have been anyone who took over those bodies, and they could have been anywhere. At the time of the great mix-up, the bodies of the 2-year-old's parents were both still on the property. The body of the mother was in the kitchen preparing breakfast, while the body of the father was upstairs in the bedroom getting dressed. Lucky for Amy, the mother's body became occupied by an older woman from America's West Coast, who had been both a mother and a grandmother in the old world. The father's body became occupied by a man from Delaware, who had been in his 40s before the great mix-up and was a father. It was a stroke of random, low-percentage luck that would work out in Amy's favor for years to come. When the person in the mother's body realized what had happened and began to settle down was when Amy approached her. Hey there," said Amy. "Do you happen to speak English?" At first, the person in the mother's body was shocked and dumbfounded at the sight of a 2-year-old speaking like an adult. She would eventually get used to it, but in that moment, she simply nodded. A very slow, cautious, nervous nod from someone who was still trying to process what was happening to them and wasn't quite ready to learn that it was happening to everyone else. "Good. Me too, obviously. My name's Amy." She held out her tiny hand, stretching it up toward the woman in the mother's body who nervously shook it. "Where were you before this? Whatever happened?" I was watching TV on my couch," said Amy. "I was watching a movie. Somewhere else, though, right? As someone else?" The woman in the mother's body nodded. She wasn't accepting her new reality as well as Amy. When Amy would look back on that moment, she would realize that she was in shock, and that was why she came off so cool. Later that night, when the shock wore off, she would experience a full-on breakdown, a breakdown that would last for days. But in those early moments, she rode that wave of shock. It may have saved her life. "Maybe there's something on TV or the internet." She looked around and didn't see a computer. "Where do you think we are, anyway?" I don't know. It's morning here, so unless we were out for a few hours, I think we might be in Europe." That's... The woman in the body of the mother began to lose her composure, then her balance. She staggered and stumbled toward the couch. Amy got out of the way. She wanted to help, but her new body was too small. The woman in the body of the mother didn't make it to the couch, but the carpet provided enough padding to cushion her fall. Not knowing what she should do, Amy just stood there and shook her head. "At least you landed in an adult body," she thought. She prodded the passed-out person in the mother's body with her tiny new foot. She was out cold. Luckily, a few minutes later, the person who was now living in the body of the father came down the stairs trying to make sense of the situation. "What the hell?" he said. Amy whipped around and saw the large, hairy man standing on the last step. "English?" "Huh? Do you speak English, sir?" He shook his head as if trying to wake from a dream. Amy, frustrated after the encounter with the person in the mother's body, snapped her fingers at the person in the father's body. Sir, do you speak English?" He shook his head clear again, then looked down at the child who was speaking to him like an adult. "Yeah, of course," Amy sighed. "Oh, thank God. Our new reality is a bit much for her. Maybe you should put her on the couch." He stared at her intuitively. "How old are you?" Amy smacked herself in the forehead. Something told her she was going to be answering that question a lot in her new reality. Eventually, the woman in the mother's body woke up. Once everyone calmed down and gained a collective grasp on the situation, they realized how lucky they were. 3 English-speaking Americans dropped into bodies similar to their original bodies, aside from Amy getting more than 30 years younger, on an isolated farm with plenty of food and supplies to survive. They agreed to stay together on that farm for as long as they could and be a team. The people in the adult bodies would even somehow fall in love against all odds, and add 2 pureborn children to the mix. Eventually, the 2-year-old body that Amy's mind had been dropped into grew into that of a teenager, and that was when her story truly began. By the 3rd year of the new world, Amy and her 2 guardians had developed a routine. They grew food on one portion of the farm while also caring for the farm's animals and using them as food. It had not been easy at first, but the guardians figured it out. Amy was still far too small to help in any physical capacity. Since her mind was plenty mature and sharp, she spent time studying anything she could get her hands on to help as best she could. One day in the fall, the farm was approached by a large group of travelers. First, Amy and her guardians heard horse hooves approaching from a distance. Eventually, a group of 25 people appeared on the horizon. The trio tried to hide, but it was no use since the visitors had previously scouted the area and knew they were there. They had no choice but to come out. Luckily, these visitors were friendly. They were representatives from a nearby settlement that had been formed in the early days and was in the process of fortifying and growing. The settlement was called Glassway, after the person who founded it. Their last name in the old world had been Glass. Although it may have seemed a very self-serving decision, the founder claimed that it was a tribute to the family they would likely never see again. It was located somewhere in what had once been known as the Ukraine. It was where Amy would spend approximately the next 12 years of her life. She became something like royalty in Glassway due to being the rare adult who jumped into a child's body and managed to survive. With very few young bodies in the world those first few years before repopulation truly ramped up, someone like Amy was to be protected at all costs. The best part of having your fully developed adult mind trapped in the body of a child is that you can learn from the mistakes you made with your former body. With this second chance, Amy dedicated herself to eating right, educating herself, and physically training her new body to maximize its potential. On the flip side, she did not enjoy going through puberty once again, although she was glad that she didn't have to experience it again while also attending high school in a small Kentucky town during the 1990s. She wasn't exactly popular as a teenager during her real life, although she hadn't been an outcast either. She met her future husband sophomore year and had a small but close-knit group of friends. It was enough. Her high school experience hadn't been epic nor tragic, nor had it been anything she wished to go through again. Lucky for her, this time around she was a graduating class of 1. By the time her new body was approximately 17 years old, Amy was both a physical and intellectual specimen. She had educated herself on everything she would need to survive in the new world. She had trained in martial arts, learned to handle all kinds of weapons, and mastered survival skills. Eventually, her patience and determination paid off. More than 15 years had passed since the Great Mix-Up. Her body was now in its late teens. She was ready. She was going to make the trip across the continent to Portstown, then board one of their ships, cross the Atlantic, and return home to what was once the United States. She spent her last night in Glassway doing the same thing she did any night when it wasn't too cold. She headed up to the roof, laid on her back, and stared up at the stars. There was something about it that helped her find some semblance of sanity in a mad world. When everything was dark and silent, and she was on her back, taking in the night sky, it was as if she was back home in the new world. It was as if none of this madness had ever happened. It was also the only time she could hear music. As the years drifted by, most of the songs she loved had faded from memory, but on the roof, with no noise and no one around, she could hear those old songs in her head. Her eyes would remain open, fixed on the stars, while dreaming of high school dances, summer nights with the kids, and romantic dinners with her husband. As much as she wanted to, she never cried at these thoughts. There was no place for that in her new life. Don't cry for the life you lost. Smile for the one you still have, was something one of Glassway's citizens had told her when her new body was still very young. He had been a soldier who lost his legs in combat in the old world. Then he woke up as a teenage girl in prime physical condition, one of the happiest people she ever met in the new world. He'd left Glassway years earlier to head west. She never heard from him again, and never would, but she would always remember how happy he was in his new, unfamiliar body, and most importantly, the words of wisdom that he had shared with her. After exchanging emotional goodbyes with her family, friends, and everyone else in Glassway, Amy joined an NETC caravan that was headed to Portstown for what was to be a long and memorable journey. It took nearly 3 months to get from Glassway to Portstown, 3 of the best and most exciting months of both Amy's lives. She had never been much of a traveler in her old life. Her hometown, her family, and her friends were all she had ever needed. In the first 15 years of her new life, she hadn't done any traveling either, only when moving from the farm to Glassway. From then until leaving, she never stepped outside the settlement's boundaries. By the time she made the trip, her mind was nearly 50 years old, and her body was estimated to be about 17. She could not wait to see what the New World Europe was like. The caravan Amy traveled with was experienced. The amount of time spent on the road varied between each member, with the longest being 12 years and the shortest being 5. This caravan was one of many known to travel the continent during net trade season. This was one specialized in clothing, bringing fresh clothes to settlements on their routes in exchange for each settlement's primary export. They made this same loop every year. Every spring they would stop in Glassway to make their annual trades, then head west to Portstown. There they would stay for a week before heading back on a different route that took them home to Old Glory for the winter. Once the seasons clicked back to spring, they saddled up and did it all over again. They all loved their work. They had friends at every stop. Amy enjoyed hearing the stories and meeting all the new people. She also loved finally getting to visit these places after hearing about them for so long. She got to drink New Bavarian Ale in New Bavaria. While in Watersway, she spent an evening drinking wine and chatting with a woman who had lived in Los Angeles and was in Las Vegas when everything changed over. They were close in age and had a blast trading stories and sharing memories of the old world. She spent a night at the famed Hotel Jojo in Brave, sipping ale by the fire while listening to the stories of the innkeeper. She enjoyed the finest meal she could remember, having discussed books with a friendly, one-footed local woman while stopping off at the Newcastle Inn. Everywhere she went, people were buzzing about the recent capture and execution of the infamous serial killer, the Skinner. She spent nights staring up at the stars, thinking about her 2 lives, her past and her future, where she had been and where she was going. Eventually, the caravan had zigged and zagged its way through what used to be Europe and reached its destination, Portstown. Once there, Amy took part in the same interview screening process as all travelers who made their way to the coastal settlement in hopes of crossing the ocean. Her application was accepted. With 2 weeks until the next voyage, she was to spend them relaxing in town. People in Portstown didn't interact with travelers more than they needed to. If Amy wanted some coffee or a meal, she interacted with locals. Otherwise, she kept to herself and awaited departure. Throughout her more than 15 years in the New World, there was one memory of her old world family that kept Amy grounded. The one she thought about every night as she closed her eyes to sleep. The last one. The day that ended with the great mix-up had been a brisk Saturday in October. Amy and her husband took their 2 small children to a local pumpkin patch. The kids ran around playing hide-and-seek among the pumpkins, while Amy and her husband laughed and filled their phones with pictures. Amy was 6 months pregnant with child number 3 at the time. Eventually, they picked out their 4 pumpkins. She and her husband joked about how it was the last time they would get 4. Then they all headed to a diner for lunch. It was one of those family-owned local businesses that just about every small town has. You walk in and people know people's names. You don't need to look at the menu because you've long ago memorized it and determined your go-tos. It was a great day. It was still only partially over. After lunch, they took a brief detour to the mall to pick up some winter clothes for their always growing older child. Clothes that would eventually be passed down to the younger child and likely the one after. While there, they bumped into some friends and got roped into a long conversation over coffee. Once home, everyone took some time to rest and get cleaned up. Then they ordered pizza from a family-owned local pizzeria and had a pumpkin carving party with a college football game on in the background. None of them were particularly good carvers, but that wasn't the point. They had a blast scooping seeds out from their pumpkins, drawing designs and carving them out. Afterwards, Amy and her husband cleaned up before placing the jack-o'-lanterns by the window and dropping some battery-powered candles in them. The poorly carved jack-o'-lanterns lit up the front window for the entire street to see. By this point, both kids were sound asleep on the couch. Amy got a glass of water while her husband carried the two children up to bed. The couple was also wiped out, but her husband didn't want to miss the end of the game. So, they went back downstairs and cuddled on the couch. Amy was asleep the instant her head hit her husband's shoulder. Had she known that when she next opened her eyes, she would be somewhere else and someone else, she would have forced herself to stay up longer and spend just a little more time with the man she loved. Still, if that day was to be the last memory of her family, then what a memory it was. She knew she would never see them again. She also knew that her real body was likely dead. It was a known fact that pregnant women did not fare well after things changed over. None of this stopped her from wanting to return home, to the place where she had lived her entire life in the old world, the place she had never wanted to leave. Regardless of how it might look after more than 15 years, Amy just had to see it. She had to go there. After that, she would let life take her where it may. After all, her new body was only about 17. She still had plenty of living left to do. First, she had to go home. The trip across the Atlantic was long and exhausting, yet exciting. Thankfully, the weather and water both cooperated for a smooth ride. Members of the ship's crew told stories of some of their less pleasant voyages, trips fraught with storms and seasickness. Amy wasn't upset about missing out on an experience like that. Having never left the United States in her old life, Amy found herself spending most of her time on the deck enjoying the views of endless ocean in all directions. Sunrises and sunsets especially captivated her. The ship's crew was comprised of 25 capable and experienced Portstowners. Their captain was a man's body that held the mind of a woman. Amy spent some time getting to know the captain. She enjoyed hearing the story of how she had been an old woman, then suddenly she was a young man, eventually making her way to Portstown and becoming captain of a transatlantic ship. It was inspiring. Amy's story of jumping into the body of a 2-year-old was a hit with fellow passengers as well as the captain and the crew. This was, of course, due to the low survival rate of people in young bodies at the start of it all. Something people had been reminding Amy of since her first day in Glassway. There was also a hint of jealousy, too. Getting to start over at such a young age. The opportunities that came with it. To do things better. To do them right. As better and right as one could do things in the new world. Most of the other passengers and crew had varying versions of the same common mix-up experience. They were from America. They had fought and struggled to survive in the early years before finding safety and purpose in a settlement. Now they wanted to go home. Getting to know those other 63 travelers was not only the highlight of the trip for Amy, it was some of the most fun she'd experienced in the new world. Learning all about who these other people had been before the Great Mix-Up, how they had lived the years since, and most importantly, why they were heading across the Atlantic beyond simply wanting to return to America. Everyone had a town or a house they wanted to see again before they died. None had any pipe dreams about reuniting with a specific person, except for one. Easily the most interesting person Amy met was a man who was now in the body of a woman. There was something sad yet hopeful about him. He rarely smiled, but when his mouth did open enough, it was impossible not to notice the multiple missing teeth. He didn't say much, at first. Wouldn't even tell Amy his name. She began mentally referring to him as the Traveler. There was something about Amy's story that really resonated with him. He was especially interested in her life before the Great Mix-Up. How she lived a simple, quiet life in a small town, married with kids and perfectly content. He would later confess that the old world life she had shared with her husband was exactly what he and his wife had been working toward when everything went to hell. At first, he refused to talk about his previous life or why he was heading across the Atlantic. He didn't like to talk about himself at all. Instead, he liked to talk about insequential things like old movies and TV shows. He'd wonder aloud as to how his favorite sports teams would have fared had the Great Mix-Up not occurred. Always significant topics unrelated to himself or whomever he was talking to. Anything to avoid getting personal. Eventually, Amy accepted this and simply enjoyed his company. She just liked the guy. She figured she probably would have gotten along with him in the old world, too. Why "Why have you waited so long?" she asked him one night. It had struck her as odd that he had waited so long to make the trip across the Atlantic, especially considering how anxious he was. It wasn't as if he spent the past 15 years starting over as a child and growing up again like she had. He stared off into the water for a moment, his thin, small-framed female body showing the toll that life in the new world had taken on it. "I had my reasons," he said with a sigh. Most nights, Amy took up residence near the old, empty pool. There she would lay on her back and stare at the stars. One thing that hadn't changed was how she loved staring at the stars. Whether it was the ones in the sky above her hometown in her old life, or the ones above Glassway, or on the road between Glassway and Portstown, there was something about the stars above her at the center of the Atlantic Ocean that truly stood out. They were so bright and beautiful. She felt like she could see beyond our solar system. It was easy to get lost in the worlds beyond ours, wondering what was out there. For approximately the first half of the voyage, she spent those nights on the old pool deck alone. Eventually, she would be joined by the traveler, who told her about nights spent staring up at the stars from the rooftops of Newcastle. "Spent a night at that inn on my way to Portstown. I remember when they finally got it up and running. Hell of a day. Hell of a day." "Is, Newcastle itself really as impressive as they say?" "From what I saw of the territory, it has to be." "Don't know what they say, but yes." "Miss it?" "No." There was a pause while they both gazed skyward. "Know anything about them?" asked Amy. "The stars?" "Yeah." "Not really, no. No, my wife does. I was always more focused on what was in front of me, not what was above me or, all around me. Same. Probably would have gotten along. Maybe." Some nights they would lay there for hours without saying a word, simply staring up in silence, each quietly reflecting upon their lives, past, present, future. Amy couldn't help wondering what was going on inside the traveler's head. He was such a closed book. Most survivors were open in discussing their past. It was often considered therapeutic. It wasn't until the last night when he finally let a piece of his personal life slip. According to the captain, the coast would appear on the horizon by morning, and they would be off the boat by sunset, meaning Amy and the traveler had only this one last night to stare up at the stars and talk. "I wonder what he's doing, or if he's even still alive," Amy said with no intent. She was simply thinking aloud. "Who?" "My husband. Try not to think about him. Been so many years, and I know the odds are against it, but a part of me hopes I'll find him. Find him on the porch when I get home, waiting for me." There was a tense silence. Without looking at him, Amy could tell this had stirred something in the traveler. Finally, he spoke. That's why I'm going back. My wife." Amy said nothing. "We used to have this rule. If we ever got split up, we'd go right home. It's taken me more than 15 years, but I'm finally doing it. I'm finally going home." There was another tense silence, the endless waves of the ocean pulsing around them. "I hope you find her. I hope you find him." Eventually the ship reached the east coast of what was once the United States of America, now commonly referred to as New America. Amy thanked the captain and her crew. They were staying shoreside for 3 weeks before loading up with more passengers and heading back to Portstown for the winter. Theirs was a life that had never intrigued the old Amy, but a part of the new Amy could see how one might find fulfillment in a life at sea. She was going to miss those Atlantic Ocean stars. One day she hoped to follow her newfound sense of adventure and see where it took her. For now, all she wanted for her young body and middle-aged mind was to get back to her pre-mix-up home and see how it had fared. It was late afternoon by the time everyone was off the ship. The settlement they were in, Wavebreak, had built their entire way of life around the transatlantic voyages between them and Portstown. Unlike Portstown, where fishing was their prime focus, and the ships coming and going were treated more like a necessary evil. Wavebreak was in what had once been known as Virginia Beach. The area had been heavily contested in the years following the Great Mix-Up. In fact, large portions of the outskirts resembled more of a war zone than a settlement. Eventually, the fighting stopped, and the portion of the area still standing became Wavebreak. When the first Portstown cruise ship arrived nearly 10 years prior, it did so just off the coast of Wavebreak. An alliance was born. Since then, Wavebreak had established an entire system for new arrivals. They were also far more welcoming than the Portstown residents who wanted as little to do with the travelers who passed through as possible. Everyone was to stay one night in a local seaside motel. It had been a motel before the Great Mix-Up as well. Once settled in her room, Amy bathed and was provided with new, clean clothes that she could keep. Then it was dinner time. According to her arrival guide, there were some old warehouses in the area that had been used to store clothing in the old world. Those warehouses were now under joint control of Wavebreak and a friendly nearby settlement. Since there were more than enough clothes stored to last decades if used sparingly, all new arrivals were gifted a set before being sent on their way. 1 pair of jeans, 1 t-shirt, 1 hooded sweatshirt, 3 pairs of fresh socks. The only items not provided were shoes and any sort of luggage or baggage. Still, the feeling of fresh, never-worn clothes was a welcome one, something Amy never thought she would experience again. Everything she had used since things changed over had been used, scavenged clothes. Kids' clothes weren't hard to find, considering the lack of people in kids' bodies those first few years. Amy essentially had all the kids' clothes in Glassway and the surrounding area to herself. All arrivals also received a gourmet dinner prepared by a local chef who had been a chef in the old world. Clam chowder, lobster, steak, wine, beer, mixed vegetables. Amy had to hand it to Wavebreak. They really knew how to make someone feel welcome. During dinner, she received a crash course in how the former United States had fared since the Great Mix-Up. She learned that a large chunk of the eastern portion of New America had come together and organized nicely after those first few dark years. Unlike old Europe, with all the individual settlements operating independently and using each other for trade both via their own traders and the NETC, the eastern portion of New America operated as a singular territory known as the New Eastern America Territory, EA, with several settlements operating beneath its umbrella, not much different from how several towns and cities had once existed within individual states that were part of the greater United States. The closest European comparison to the EA was the Greater Newcastle Territory, yet the EA was at least 3 times the size of the GNT. Things became a bit less stable once outside of EA territory. Some areas, especially major cities, had been completely lost. That was no different from old Europe. There was plenty of hope for the future of New America, thanks to EA leadership and something called reclamation that Sarah wouldn't learn more about until later. After dinner, it was time to wind down and rest. Amy spent some time with her new friend, the Traveler. They would be heading in different directions come morning. The Traveler was staying within EA territory, heading south to what used to be North Carolina, where he had lived before everything changed over. Conveniently for him, the gated community he had once called home was within the first boundaries of Craftburg, one of the largest, most influential and important settlements in the territory. Amy, on the other hand, was heading west beyond EA borders into contested territory. She had been assured that she would be provided with a guide who would also serve as a guard as she attempted to return to her old home. Amy and the Traveler enjoyed one last night looking at the stars and chatting. It wasn't the same as it had been on the ocean. Amy tried to get more information about him, but he remained a steel trap. He had said all he was ever going to say, and that was that. After a good night's sleep, the arrivals were treated to a hearty breakfast. Then it was time for final goodbyes and to hit the road. Wavebreak had dedicated teams of people whose jobs were to help new arrivals get to where they were going. They used the old railroad system as much as possible. A lot of it was back up and running, thanks largely to settlements within the EA that had formed around mining coal and using it as their primary export. The railways could only take people so far, though. Once they traveled beyond EA borders, they became dangerous. but it would get people closer to their destination a lot faster than horses. Amy's destination was a settlement at the edge of the territory. There she would meet her hired guide, who would escort her into Kentucky. Once she reached her old home, she would decide if she wanted to rehire the guide to escort her elsewhere or part ways. Amy was thankful for such an organized system. She said goodbye to the traveler and wished him well. "I hope she's waiting for you. I hope he's waiting for you," she smiled. Let's be honest," she said. "Odds are against us, but hopefully at least one of us gets what we want." "Sounds good to me." "By the way," she added, "heard that where you're going is quite the place." "Yeah," he said. "Apparently. I guess the train will take me right to the doorstep, too. How about that? Any, word on where you're going?" "Sadly, no. Not really. My old town is outside the territory. Gotta go on horseback." He shook his head. "Sure you don't want to just come south with me? Check out this Kraftberg place? I have to admit it sounds nice, but I gotta do this. Well, if you ever get there and decide it's not worth staying, I'll keep a seat warm under the stars, just in case." "Sounds nice. Maybe our paths will cross again." He nodded. They shook hands. Then she boarded the train and headed west. Along with being on a boat and putting on fresh clothes, riding on a train was yet another thing Amy experienced on this trip that she never thought she would again. Yet, there she was, chugging west on a near-full locomotive more than 15 years after the world ended. It was a short train consisting of only 10 cars: the steam-powered locomotive, the coal car, 1 passenger car, 4 military transport cars, 3 supply cars. The passenger car was half full of travelers like Amy, as well as supply officers and 2 doctors. Amy was seated next to one of the doctors. He had been an 82-year-old retired doctor in the Old World who currently resided in the body of a woman in her early to mid-30s. Amy figured his brain was as good as any to pick about life in New America after the mix-up. The napkin note overview she had been provided back in Wavebreak had not been nearly enough, especially since she was heading toward unclaimed territory. Before they could get to the good stuff, Amy had to answer the curious doctor's questions about her history. After all, it wasn't often, if ever, that one met someone who jumped into the body of a 2-year-old and survived. "Fascinating," he kept saying as she detailed the events that transpired after everything changed over. From the farm in what used to be Eastern Europe to life in Glassway and her eventual journey west. He was riveted by her story. He didn't go into much detail about his journey, and she didn't ask. As a doctor, he had more or less spent his time post-mix-up treating the sick and wounded in service of the new Eastern America territory. Not the type to stay in one place for long, he had done tours as a temporary physician in all EA settlements from Kraftberg to Wavebreak and more. "First few years were rough. We had that same, chaos and confusion that happened everywhere." Amy nodded. "Then people began grouping up. Small factions formed, more fighting, lots of it, actually. Overall, the usual stuff: land, resources, which language to speak, which god to worship." Amy nodded again. It was all sounding so familiar. "Within all that chaos, a couple of powerful settlements rose up. There's Kraftberg. Now, they're down south in the Carolinas. You've probably heard of them." Amy nodded. My friend from the ship was headed there. Used to live somewhere within their boundaries back in the old days." "Funny. Friend of mine there, head physician, used to live there in the Old World, too. Anyway, aside from Kraftberg, there's Tribunal. Now, they're in the old North Carolina, off an old river. Pamco, something like that. There's Wavebreak. No need to explain them. A couple other places I'll skip, otherwise we'll be here all night. But last and most important is Destiny." "Destiny?" He rolled his eyes and they both laughed. "I know. Who the hell comes up with these new names, right? Some funny ones back overseas, too." "Right. Like the place you're from." "Yeah, Glassway, named after the founder's mother." "Kraftberg, too. Believe it or not, well, sort of. Founder's Old World last name. Yeah, I think that's it for Glassway. Anyway, what makes Destiny special is it's an actual city, a smaller one. But still, Destiny's in what used to be Raleigh, North Carolina. How the hell did they pull that off? I was there. A couple of well armed factions came together, took it by force. Clean sweep. Anyone got in the way was put down. It was ugly. Worse than anything I saw in Nam. You were in Vietnam? He nodded. Where I cut my teeth as a doctor. Never thought I'd see anything like it again. Then this happened. Yeah, exactly. Anyway, they took Raleigh and Durham, for that matter, secured 'em as one settlement and named it Destiny, for some reason. Then they set about to recruiting and rebuilding. By year 10, they were far and away the most powerful settlement in the region by pure population and might. I'd like to see it someday. No, you wouldn't. Complete military state. I got out first chance I could. How'd they bring everyone together? Join us or die? He nodded. Basically, yeah. Sent emissaries to all the big settlements and requested that their founders and leadership come to Destiny. All who refused were wiped out. Wasn't many. I think maybe 2 settlements refused. Then once everyone got to Destiny, there was a big meeting, and from it the new Eastern America territory was born, with Destiny as the capital. I thought Kraftberg was the capital. If only. No, Kraftberg's more like the heart of the territory. Destiny's the brain. And they're on complete lockdown at all times. Like I said, military state. Kraftberg is like the new New York, I suppose. Wonderful place. If you ever decide to return east after doing whatever it is you must do, I suggest Kraftberg. Noted. So, what's going on with this reclamation I heard about? How much time do you have? Wait until the end of the line. Well, in short, the long-term goal of the EA is to reclaim as much of the old United States as they can. Rebuild it all into one united nation again. Right now, the goal is everything east of the Mississippi. After that, they hope to head west. What's going on out west? He shook his head. Total blackout. Anything's possible. Judging by the soldiers and supplies on the train, I take it reclamation not going well. He shook his head. As you can imagine, during the decade in which the EA was formed, other settlements and alliances were formed beyond our borders, and they're not looking to buy what we're selling. Why not? Don't want to be ruled. They want to rule. Think about it. We're 15 years into this thing. Pretty soon, we'll have nearly as many full-grown pureborns as old worlds. Most smart people I talk to predict we'll be able to reclaim all cities, even the major ones, in the next 5 years. Have the power grid back up in 10. After that, who knows? Really? Think about it. What happened in all the cities? It's a miracle anyone still survives in them. They're basically hellholes, war zones, and tombs. It's unsustainable. Their numbers and strength are dwindling. Eventually, they'll be ripe for the picking. And so the EA wants the cities. Land around them, too. Whole damn continent. No different than the old world. Control the land, control the resources, control everything. So it's about power? What else is there? She shook her head. Is there like a president or something? He shook his head. There's a council in Destiny. Call themselves the 9. Because there's 9 of them, obviously. Obviously. What's the name of the territory to the west? What do they call themselves? Well, that's our advantage. It isn't one single united territory. It's a bunch of individual settlements. They don't even like each other for the most part. Sometimes they grit their teeth and unite to fight us. Sometimes they remember they hate each other and start fighting each other. Why not just let them kill each other? Then swoop in and clean up while they're weak and vulnerable. What if they unite? Like really unite? I think we'd rather fight multiple smaller, disorganized settlements than one organized territory. Why not just leave them be? Instead of fighting, work with them, form alliances, trade networks, all that. Like how we did it over in old Europe. It's great what you all managed to do in old Europe, or whatever it's called, but not happening here. Got a whole new world manifest destiny thing going on, and, well, in Destiny, everyone else in the territory has no choice but to do their part. Can't let the big, bad, unseen enemy behind the borders get bigger and one day invade us. She shook her head. And you're going out there to treat soldiers? I'm 19 all over again. Good luck. I'll be okay. Doing this a long time. Sooner or later, my luck will run out. Until then, I'll do what I can. It's you I should be wishing well. Heading out into unclaimed with nothing but a guide? Every now and then, someone originally from out west decides to recruit a guide to go home. Never even seen one of the guides come back. Then why are so many willing to take the job? A lot of people in this world were close to death in the old one. A lot of them have developed real cowboy attitudes over the last 15. Doesn't even make sense. Letting me wander off into a war zone with a lone guide. He shrugged. Your life, your choice, I guess. For the first time since leaving Glassway, Amy was beginning to question whether she had made the right choice. Although they had warned her back in Wavebreak that going west beyond EA borders was dangerous, they had certainly undersold just how dangerous. The safety of life behind walls was starting to sound mighty fine, but it was too late. She was on the train, her old home getting closer with each passing second. She had to see what was there. She had heard enough of what the doctor had to say, and by the look of him, he had said all he wanted to say. She turned her head to the window and for the first time since leaving Wavebreak observed the landscape. The old steam-powered train was not as fast as the modern trains she had ridden in the old world. Trains that were obsolete in the new world. Most of what she saw out the window was emptiness. It didn't look all that different from the landscapes in what used to be Europe. With the population decimated post-mix-up, the majority of people still alive in New America were either in cities, safe behind settlement walls, or roving the landscape off the grid. Why had she decided to go back to Kentucky? It had seemed so close in her mind. Now it couldn't have seemed further. She wasn't sure how long she had been sleeping. Long enough for day to turn to night. She didn't have time to think about it anyway. There was only survival mode, and it was kicking in harder than ever. A blast had rocked the train. They were under attack. Shit, this area's supposed to be safe, yelled the doctor as he grabbed his bag and ran for cover. Amy was on her own as the train descended into frantic chaos. The front locomotive had been hit. She wasn't sure how. She could see the fire through her window. All the soldiers were scrambling to grab their weapons and go fight. Most were gunned down the moment they stepped off the train. There were at least 100 attackers. Amy watched through her window. While everyone else on the train was scrambling, she was hunkering down, hoping to ride it out. See how things shook out and go from there. It wasn't long before all the EA soldiers had been wiped out or captured, same as everyone else who fled the train. Amy couldn't get a good look at the attackers due to the dark of night. She could only make out their outlines as they advanced upon the train. There was only one option. Put her hands up and hope they didn't shoot her on sight. As they entered her train car with guns out, she was already standing in the center of the aisle with her hands up screaming, "Don't shoot. I'm unarmed." They didn't shoot. Her wrists were shackled in some very old, well-worn handcuffs, and she was yanked forcefully off the train, despite not putting up a fight. By this point, the attackers had lit fires, which provided some visibility. As Amy was pulled off the train, the first thing she noticed was the doctor's bullet-riddled corpse, splayed out just a few feet from where he stepped off. The second thing she noticed was the attackers stealing from the supply cars and loading everything into their wagons. The soldier who had Amy by the neck was wearing a male body. He threw her to the ground in front of someone who was clearly in charge. This person wore the body of a woman. Amy couldn't make out any specific features in the darkness. They spoke rapidly back and forth in French. Amy didn't understand French. She assumed they were discussing what to do with her. The soldier grabbed the chain holding her handcuffs together and lifted her to her feet with it. The pain on her wrists was excruciating. and she howled. The open hand of the commanding officer rattled Amy's face, and she immediately went quiet. She was then berated in French. Perhaps she was being questioned. She had no idea, and she let it be known. No French! No French! Ugh, American. The hand connected with Amy's face again, only this time it was a closed fist right to the temple. Darkness followed. When she came to, she was on the floor of a transport wagon not unlike what she had ridden in while with the NETC caravan. Her head was throbbing, and she couldn't rub it thanks to her hands still being cuffed behind her back. She rolled onto her back, looked up, and made eye contact with one of the soldiers, someone in a mid to late 20s man's body. Upon seeing her looking at him, the person in the man's body spat on her. Others laughed. Then they all joined in. Soon she was covered in spit, while they continued to laugh and joke in French. "Please," she said, pleading to them. The only response was a boot to the face, followed by more darkness. Water splashed her face, waking her from her unconsciousness. She was still in the wagon, only it was now empty, save for her and a soldier whom she had not previously seen. He was splashing her and shouting in French, likely obscenities due to his tone. He smacked her face a few times to make sure she was present, then laughed some more. Like the previous soldier had, he lifted her by the chain connecting her handcuffs. It hurt even worse the second time around. He didn't let go when she was standing. Instead, he dragged her out of the wagon by the handcuffs. She thought her wrists would break from the force. The moment she was pulled out of the wagon, she was greeted by a person in a very large, intimidating, and imposing body of a woman. "Hello, American," said the woman. Amy immediately recognized her voice from before. Amy opened her mouth to reply, but the person in the woman's body immediately smashed a filthy sock into it. Then she wrapped and tied an old T-shirt around Amy's head to keep the disgusting gag in place. After that, she pulled the black bag down over Amy's head. Everything was dark again, but at least this time she was still conscious. After more dragging through various unseen locations, Amy was thrown to the ground with a crack, her shoulder nearly dislocated from the force, but managed to hold. The bag and gag were removed, but her vision was too hazy to take in where she was. Then she heard the unmistakable sound of a metal gate being slammed shut and locked. Inaudible French was hissed at her. "Can't one of you assholes speak English?" She hissed back while waiting for her eyes to refocus. More inaudible French was hissed at her. She blinked her eyes a few times and vision finally returned. She was in a holding cell in a small police station. It was filthy after more than 15 years of being both used and neglected. She finally caught sight of where the French was coming from. It was the same person who greeted her when she woke up on the wagon. He was continuing to speak at her in French, while motioning with his right hand. "What?" she said. Realizing she would never understand, he began pointing at her handcuffs, then motioning to approach him. Then he showed that he had a key. "Oh," she said. Bracing herself against one of the cell walls, she managed to stand. Then she walked to the raider soldier and turned her back to him. A few seconds later, she was finally free from the handcuffs. The raider soldier took his leave. She was all alone. Her wrists were cut, bruised and bleeding. Her head was throbbing. Her shoulder screamed. Her stomach growled. She had never felt so alone. 3 days. She spent 3 days in that cell. 3 times a day she received a lone visitor who brought her food, stale bread, and dirty water. She wasn't too concerned about potential bacteria in the water, since she'd probably be dead soon anyway. There was a time in her old life when she wouldn't drink anything that didn't come out of a sealed bottle, or at a minimum a filtered tap. She got to know every inch of what used to be a small-town police station. However, there wasn't much to get to know. The place had long ago been stripped of anything useful. All that remained were the rotted old mattress in her cell, a desk, and a chair outside the cell. Nothing else. Bare bones. Finally, a visitor. A real one. Late 30s body, female, well built. The body had likely belonged to an athlete in the old world. They walked into the room alone, found the only chair, placed it just beyond the bars of Amy's cell, and took a seat. Sorry for all this. Amy's shoulders slumped, and she let out a relieved sigh. Finally, someone who speaks English. They removed a cigarette from a pack, then lit it with a match. Mind? Amy shrugged. Course you don't. Nearly 16-year-old cigarette. Can you believe it? Well, most everything was in its place after things changed over. That's right. Teach you that in school? What? No, I was there. The person in the woman's body shot Amy a suspicious look. Amy sighed. Here we go. I jumped into the body of a 2-year-old. And lived? Amy told her story up to that point. Waking up as a kid, waiting until she was old enough, making the trip to Portstown, then across the Atlantic through Wavebreak and onto the train in hopes of returning to her old world home. The visitors sat silently smoking cigarettes and listening until it was over. After the story had ended, silence hung in the near-empty old police station for an uncomfortable amount of time. The visitor dropped their cigarette butt to the floor and stomped it out, then got up and paced. Ever make it to London while you were out there? Amy shook her head. Ever hear anything about it? Made a friend on the boat here who woke up there. Said it was bad, real bad. The visitor nodded, lit another cigarette, then stared at the smoke drifting off the end of it. Took the boat, huh? Came through Wavebreak? Amy nodded. The visitor kept staring at the smoke wafting off her cigarette. You know, I never touched these before everything. This place, this town, where you are, not too far from where I woke up when things turned. Things were bad. I had no business surviving. I'm no fighter. Was a 5'4" skinny young woman in the old world. Lived in a posh high-rise in London. Went to bed with just the hottest guy the night before. Still think about him. Suddenly, next thing I know, I'm in this body. Younger, of course. There was a college a few miles from here. That's where I was. She stopped and silently reflected while taking drags. Anyway, I won't bore you with the details. Once we got through that first winter and secured this town, we started exploring. There's some warehouses not far from here. One had booze, another had paper towels. One had cigarettes, others had other things. That was when I started. She laughed. I imagine if things here were like they are back over in Europe, they'd be our main export. Instead, we just keep 'em for ourselves. Amy wasn't really interested in this woman's story. What are you going to do with me? That's what they've been discussing the past 3 days. They? Not you? Oh, me? I'm not leadership. I'm like a diplomat, I guess you could say. In case you didn't notice, everyone here speaks French. Oh, I noticed. Yeah, well, I speak French, English, Italian, German, and Dutch. Spoils of a privileged education. Anyway, they've been sending me to do other nearby settlements on... She hesitated, then decided to change directions. Business. Amy thought about it a moment. Then she thought about what the doctor had told her on the train, and it hit her. Trying to form an alliance, aren't you? Fight the EA? Yes, but it's more than that. We're fighting for our lives. Meet anyone who didn't speak English in the EA? Amy shook her head. Exactly. EA isn't interested in having us join them. They want to conquer us. Whomever they don't kill, they'll enslave. I'd technically be okay, but I'm literally the only one here who speaks English. That's why you sat here 3 days. Had to wait till I got back. Why are you telling me all this? Why not? You have no obligation to the EA. Thing is, we don't want to fight them. We're not looking to invade or conquer, only to defend. We offered to be allies with EA, trade and all that. They declined. They want our heads, then our land. What do you want from me? Information. I don't know anything. Sure you do. You were in Wave Break. You were on that train. You've seen things. Talk to people. Whatever you got, we want. And in exchange, we'll let you go. You're going to let me go. We're not the bad guys here. I know you were treated awful, and I'm sorry about that. But they thought you were one of them. You have no idea what these EA soldiers have been doing to us and our allies. I have some ideas. So, tell us what you know. Then we'll let you go. We'll even take you back to the EA border if you want to go back. Maybe you can go settle in Wavebreak. Kraftberg. What? I'd go to Kraftberg. Ah, yes, I've heard of that place. Makes sense. If I ever wanted to defect, that's where I'd go. I wouldn't recommend trying to go home, though. It doesn't get any prettier out that way. But say I did give you information. Then I go back to EA and Kraftberg or wherever. What good does that do me if you're just going to attack? Seems kind of like I'm screwed either way. The visitor nodded. Fair question. Between you and me, we only want destiny. Destiny falls, and the EA is kaput. Everyone goes back to being independent. Makes sense, but how do I know I can believe you? The visitor shook her head. You don't? You can't. But it's either that or you die. So what do you have to lose? Amy stared at the visitor. Then she looked at her wrists. She felt defeated. All the hope of ever seeing her old home again had died with the people on that train. Anyway, said the visitor, I'll let you sleep on it. I don't need to sleep on it. The black bag was back over her head. At least she was no longer gagged. That sock had probably taken at least 3 years off her life. The visitor's voice kept her company on the wagon ride. How much longer? She asked. Not long. She had told them all she knew. Everything the doctor had told her. They were especially pleased to learn what Amy knew about Destiny, specifically its location. That was something they hadn't known. They only knew it by name and reputation. Eventually, they reached EA territory. The wagon stopped. Amy was escorted out, and the bag was removed from her head. She was face to face with the visitor. Kraftberg's about 15 miles that way. She pointed in the direction of Kraftberg. I imagine scouts will pick you up beforehand. Here's a knife. She handed Amy an old military-issue knife. And here's a backpack with some food and water. Should be more than enough to get you there. Thank you. I don't understand, but thank you. Like I said, we're not the bad guys. We just want to live in peace. What are you going to do? Like I said, they don't let me in on those conversations, but I imagine we'll be gunning for Destiny in the near future. If I were you, when I got to Kraftberg, I wouldn't leave, and I definitely wouldn't take a trip to Destiny any time ever. Amy nodded. Again, said Amy, thank you. Thank you. It wasn't a lot of information, but it was good information. Well, if you ever do decide to defect, come to Kraftberg. Look me up. The visitor laughed. I'll keep that in mind. Go. Only a few hours of light left. Amy nodded, then turned and began walking in the direction of Kraftberg, to the place that would be her home until the day she died many, many years later.